Usually when you look at the historical record of major military conflicts, there's this expectation of symmetry, right?
Oh, yeah, like a chessboard.
Exactly, like a chessboard.
Yeah.
You expect to see one empire in red, another in blue. Both have, state-sanctioned generals, established supply lines, standing armies, and they just meet on a battlefield to hash out the geopolitics.
Yeah, because we crave that symmetry. I mean, power is just easiest to understand when it actually looks like power.
Right.
When the people shaking the world are already standing on top of it, the mechanics of a war make logical sense to us. We can track the movement of the legions or the funding from the Senate, the siege engines. The data points are institutional.
But when you step into the Roman Republic during the 1st century BC, that chessboard is just completely flipped over.
Oh, totally destroyed.
Yeah. We're looking at a military landscape that defies every single institutional metric you could think of. Because our subject today is a man who started with absolutely nothing. I mean, legally, he was defined as property. And he somehow built this mobile war machine that brought the greatest superpower on Earth to the absolute brink of collapse.
It's just incredible.
It really is. And we are unpacking a massive stack of sources today for this deep dive. We've got historical analysis from Barry Strauss of the Hoover Institution, ancient texts from Roman historians like Sallust and Appian, and the chronicles of the Third Servile War, which raged from 73 to 71 BC.
Yeah, and the mission today for you listening is to completely strip away that shiny Hollywood veneer surrounding Spartacus.
Yes.
We need to examine the brutal mechanics of how a single enslaved man, literally locked in a barracks, orchestrated an uprising of roughly 100,000 people.
100,000, it's wild, and humiliated the Roman military apparatus time and time again. So, okay, let's unpack this.
We really have to focus on the mechanics here because, the mythological version of Spartacus totally obscures the actual logistical and tactical genius it took to pull this off.
Right, the movie version leaves out the actual work.
Exactly. And to understand the rebellion, you first have to understand the hyper-militarized ecosystem that created the rebel in the first place.
Right. So where did the ancient sources say he started out?
So they point us to Thrace as his birthplace. On a modern map, you'd be looking at the Balkans.
Yeah.
So a region spanning parts of modern-day Turkey, Bulgaria, and Greece.
Okay, got it.
And the Thracians had this very intense martial culture that the Romans deeply respected. And crucially, the text suggests Spartacus did not start his military career as an enemy of Rome.
Wait, really? So he was on their side?
Yeah, he served inside the Roman military apparatus as an auxiliary.
Okay, the auxiliary system is critical to dissect here because he wasn't just, a random recruit handed a spear.
Yeah, not all.
Auxiliaries were these non-citizen soldiers recruited from the provinces, right? They were integrated into Roman campaigns to provide specialized skills that the heavy infantry of the Roman legions lacked, like cavalry, archery, skirmishing.
Exactly. So Spartacus is operating inside the belly of the beast. He's experiencing Roman camp discipline firsthand.
Oh, wow. So he's watching how a centurion organizes a cohort. He's studying Roman tactical doctrines from the inside.
Yes. Sallust explicitly notes his, and this is a quote, enormous strength and spirit combined with a highly developed military intelligence. But, his trajectory violently shifts. He goes from wearing a Roman uniform to being sold into slavery.
Do we know why? What was the charge?
The historical record is pretty fragmented on the exact charge. I mean, it might have been desertion, a mutiny, or maybe just refusal to fight in a specific campaign.
But I guess the ambiguity of the charge almost doesn't matter compared to the severity of the punishment.
Right. He was stripped of all autonomy. But his physical prowess and combat experience actually kept him from being sent to the silver mines, which, let's be honest, was essentially a slow death sentence.
Yeah, a horrific way to go.
Instead, the Roman state recognized him as a highly valuable asset for, of all things, their entertainment industry. So in 73 DC, he is sold to Eludus, which is a gladiator training school in the city of Capua. That's roughly 25 miles north of modern-day Naples. And he was specifically trained to fight as a murmillo.
Okay, I want to break down exactly what being a murmillo entailed, because this heavily informs the tactics he uses later.
Oh, absolutely.
This wasn't theatrical, choreographed stage fighting like wrestling today. The murmillo class were the absolute heavyweights of the arena. They carried a scutum, which is that massive, curved, rectangular shield used by actual Roman legionnaires.
Right, the classic Roman shield.
Yeah. And they fought with a gladius, the short terrifyingly efficient Roman stabbing sword, and their armor was asymmetrical, right?
Yeah, so they had heavy greaves on the legs, a manica protecting the sword arm, and this massive enclosing helmet with a fish crest. But the key here is it had these tiny eye slits.
So they couldn't see well.
Exactly. The helmet severely restricted vision and hearing. You're basically training a man to fight in a state of sensory deprivation. He has to rely entirely on muscle memory, footwork, and just extreme close-quarters lethality. You're training him to endure claustrophobia and panic while a massive crowd is literally screaming for his blood.
So the psychological conditioning of that environment just cannot be overstated.
Not at all. And this brings us to the socioeconomic reality of the Italian peninsula at this exact moment, which, Barry Strauss emphasizes as the structural foundation for the entire war.
Right, the demographics. Let's get into that.
So Italy had a total population of roughly 5 million people at the time. Out of those 5 million, historians estimate as many as 1.5 million were enslaved.
That statistic is that's the engine of this entire story. Nearly 30% of the human beings on the peninsula were classified as property.
Yeah, 30%.
And this wasn't just a static system, right? It was a rapidly expanding industrial complex. Rome's continuous wars of expansion meant there was this constant influx of human captives.
Exactly. The wealthy patrician class was buying up massive tracts of public land, and they were replacing paid Roman peasant labor with free slave labor to run these colossal agricultural estates. They called them latifundia.
So you just have hundreds of thousands of people enduring horrific labor conditions, chained together in fields, completely isolated from their homelands.
Right. But the contrast between those slaves on the latifundia and the gladiators on the ludus, it represents this really bizarre paradox in Roman society.
How so?
Well, gladiators, as Strauss points out, were expensive investments. Olanista, the owner of the Gladiator School, poured serious money into their upkeep.
Right, you don't want your star athletes starving.
Exactly. They received high-calorie diets, heavily focused on barley and beans. This was to build a layer of subcutaneous fat that would actually protect major blood vessels from shallow cuts in the arena.
Oh, that's incredibly calculating.
Yeah. And they had access to some of the best medical care in the ancient world, like famous physicians. Galen, for example. He got his start treating gladiators.
Wait, really? The famous Dr. Galen?
Yeah, because it was essentially a master class in human anatomy and trauma surgery. They even had access to women and occasionally got to keep a portion of their prize money.
But I look at those, and I'm using air quotes here, privileges, and I struggle to see how the Romans justified the risk. I mean, you have an empire that relies on the violent suppression of 1.5 million desperate, starving people.
Right.
The entire economy is built on a powder keg of human misery. And to entertain themselves, the Roman elite take seasoned military veterans, force them into bondage, feed them a highly specialized diet, give them top-tier physical therapy, arm them with the exact weapons used by the Roman military, and train them to become desensitized killing machines.
It's insane when you lay it out like that.
It's like being a VIP on death row, you know? You get the best meals, but you're still just waiting for the executioner. Aren't they just manufacturing their own worst nightmare? The logic is just baffling to me.
It speaks to the absolute blinding hubris of the Roman Republic. I mean, they did not view Spartacus or the other gladiators as a military threat because they simply didn't view them as men.
Oh, wow.
They categorized them alongside dangerous beasts in a menagerie. It's like you keep the lion in a strong cage, you feed it well, and you release it for the show. The Romans believed the architecture of the ludus, the iron bars, the armed guards, they thought it was infallible.
They operated on the assumption that a slave, by definition, lacked the organizational capacity to challenge the state.
Exactly. And that assumption absolutely shatters in 73 BC.
Right. The breakout from the Capua Ludus, that's the spark. And the mechanics of this escape are incredibly revealing.
So what happens is Spartacus and roughly 70 other gladiators realize they're slated for an upcoming series of games that will very likely result in a massacre.
Right. They're being set up to die.
Yeah, so they decide to preempt it. But they don't have access to their murmillo armor or their swords. The Romans' security protocols at least mandated that the lethal weaponry be locked away in armories under heavy guard when not in use for training.
So they improvise with literally the only resources available to them. They force their way into the kitchens of the compound.
Right.
We're talking about 70 Massive, heavily trained men arming themselves with roasting spits, meat cleavers, and heavy iron cauldrons.
Yeah.
And the close quarters combat training they received in the arena instantly translates to this environment. A meat cleaver in the hands of a trained murmillo is a devastating weapon against some guard with a spear in a narrow hallway.
It's a bloodbath.
Mhm.
They fight their way out of the ludus and out into the streets of Capua. And this is where their luck turns, or rather where they seize a really critical opportunity.
What happens?
They manage to intercept and capture a wagon transport that is hauling actual gladiatorial weapons to another city.
Oh, wow. Talk about timing.
Seriously. So suddenly, they aren't just desperate men with kitchen knives anymore. They have swords, shields, daggers. They fight their way out of the city gates. And once they hit the countryside, they immediately establish a command structure.
Right. They don't just run wild.
No, they elect Spartacus as one of their primary leaders, alongside two very formidable Gallic gladiators, Crixus and Neamus.
And the election of leaders from different ethnic backgrounds, Thracian and Gallic, that demonstrates an immediate understanding that they need a unified coalition, right? They know they can't survive as just an isolated band of 70 fugitives.
Exactly. So they head toward the slopes of Mount Vesuvius. And keep in mind, at this point in history, Vesuvius isn't the apocalyptic volcano we associate with the destruction of Pompeii over a century later.
Right, it hadn't blown its top yet.
Right. It was this steep, rugged caldera, heavily overgrown with wild vines and really dense woods. It offered high ground, concealment, and a defensible perimeter.
And along the way to Vesuvius, they start raiding the wealthy Latvandia estates bordering the Via Appia. Every time they strike a plantation, they strip it of food, horses, supplies, but more importantly, they liberate the enslaved workforce.
Yeah, they're recruiting.
Those agricultural slaves join the ranks. So the force grows from 70 to several hundred in a matter of days. And the Roman Senate receives reports of this, but their response is just incredibly tepid. They basically treat it as a localized policing issue.
Yeah, they send a praetor, Gaius Claudius Glaber, with an expeditionary force of about 3,000 men.
But we really have to scrutinize the quality of this force. Rome's primary battle-hardened legions were not sitting in Italy waiting for a domestic disturbance.
No, they were deployed all across the Mediterranean fighting actual wars.
Exactly. So Glaber's force was essentially a hastily conscripted militia, just men pulled from the surrounding areas with minimal training. But despite leading an inferior force, Glaber operates with standard Roman military arrogance.
Oh, peak arrogance. He arrives at Vesuvius, identifies the single accessible path up the mountain, and just sets up a blockade at the base.
His tactical assessment is basically, I don't need to risk my men in a dangerous uphill assault through dense brush. He decides to just starve the gladiators out.
Right.
And this is where Glaber commits a fatal error in Roman military doctrine. The sources indicate he completely neglected to build a proper castra.
Yeah, a fortified encampment.
Right, with a palisade wall and a defensive ditch. That was standard procedure for Roman armies every single night they camped, no matter where they were. But he assumed the gladiators were trapped and totally incapable of an offensive maneuver.
He fundamentally underestimated his opponent.
Yeah.
I mean, Spartacus doesn't wait to starve. He assesses the geology of the caldera.
Okay, and what does he find?
Well, the Romans left this sheer rocky cliff face, completely unguarded because it was virtually impassable on foot. But the cliff was choked with these thick, wild grapevines.
Oh.
Spartacus orders his men to harvest these vines, weaving them together to create massive, durable ropes. And under the cover of darkness, the gladiators use these vine ropes to rappel down the sheer drop.
Here's where it gets really interesting to me, because it sounds like an ancient special ops mission or like a high-stakes prison break movie.
Totally.
The logistics of this operation are just staggering. You have dozens, perhaps hundreds of men, carrying stolen weapons, descending a cliff face in the dark in total silence. If a single man slips or a shield clatters against the rocks, the Romans are alerted.
Exactly. The tension must have been unbelievable.
But they successfully hit the ground, bypass the Roman blockade entirely, and execute a wide flanking maneuver to attack Glaber's unfortified camp from the rear.
And the resulting massacre is absolute. The Romans are caught sleeping, they're completely disorganized. The gladiators rout the entire force of 3,000 men.
Which raises the question, how does a trained Roman legion, even an untested one of 3,000 men, allow 70 gladiators, well, maybe a few hundred by this point, to completely flank and annihilate them? Was it pure Roman arrogance?
Oh, 100%. They were so confident that slaves couldn't execute a complex military maneuver that they literally went to sleep.
Wow.
And this victory at Vesuvius, it's the inflection point of the entire conflict. Spartacus doesn't just win a battle. He captures thousands of pieces of military-grade Roman armor, legionary shields, javelins, and this massive supply train.
Right.
The psychological impact of a Roman praetor being humiliated by runaway slaves sends shockwaves across the whole peninsula.
The legend of Spartacus just detonates. The recruitment pool explodes. The sources detail how the rebel army swells at an astonishing rate, eventually reaching estimates of 90,000 to 100,000 people.
Yeah, a massive, massive force.
And this introduces a huge logistical nightmare that I feel like the ancient texts often just gloss over. How do you feed, organize, and sanitize a mobile city of 100,000 people?
It's nearly impossible.
You have Thracians, Gauls, Germans, and Greeks. You have dozens of different languages, religious practices, cultural animosities. And it's not just soldiers. You have men, women, children, the elderly.
The organizational capacity required to keep this massive migrating coalition from collapsing under its own weight or just tearing itself apart from internal friction is arguably Spartacus's greatest achievement.
Yeah, more than the battles even.
Exactly. He had to establish foraging parties that wouldn't strip a region so bare that the army itself starved the next day. He had to organize the distribution of captured weapons, drill untrained farmhands into fighting units, and manage this vast network of camp followers.
And if we connect this to the bigger picture, the demographics of this massive army begin to shift in a way that truly terrifies the Senate. It wasn't just escaped agricultural slaves anymore. Free Roman citizens started joining the rebellion.
Right, the peasants.
Dispossessed, impoverished peasants, the rural plebeians who had been forced off their ancestral farms by the wealthy elites expanding their latifundia. They saw Spartacus not as a slave revolt, but as an opportunity for class warfare. They had more in common with the starving slaves than they did with the senators in Rome.
And the inclusion of Roman freemen transforms the servile war into a complete existential crisis for the Republic.
Oh.
The social contract was fracturing.
Yeah.
Rome's reaction is to finally deploy consular armies led by seasoned politicians.
Sure.
But again, we must look at the broader geopolitical map. The Republic is fighting a two-front war on the edges of its empire.
Right, they're distracted.
Very. In Hispania, modern-day Spain, the rogue general Quintus Sertorius is leading a brilliant, grueling guerrilla war against Rome's best commanders. He's tying down tens of thousands of elite legionnaires.
And in the east, too, right?
Yeah, in modern-day Turkey, King Mithridates VI is waging a massive, protracted conflict against Roman expansion.
So the military resources available on the Italian peninsula itself are stretched dangerously thin. And Spartacus and his co-commander Crixus exploit this vulnerability.
They do.
Despite losing in Nomasus in early skirmishes, they systematically dismantle the successive forces sent against them. They march north, cutting a swath through the Apennine Mountains, heading towards Cisalpine Gaul, which is modern-day northern Italy. But as they achieve this unprecedented success, a massive strategic fracture occurs within the leadership.
Right, and this is one of the most heavily debated aspects of the Servile War. The ancient historians frame the split as a moral failing on the part of Crixus.
How do they frame it?
Well, the traditional narrative asserts that Spartacus had this singular noble vision: march the army over the Alps, exit the Italian peninsula, and allow the various ethnic groups to disperse back to their homelands in Thrace, Gaul, and Germania.
Okay, and Crixus?
Crixus, conversely, is depicted as being consumed by greed and a desire for vengeance. Supposedly, he just wanted to stay in Italy to plunder the rich cities of the south.
I have to challenge that traditional moralistic framing, though. I mean, if you look at the map of the ancient world in 72 BC, Spartacus' plan to just go home is deeply flawed.
Oh, absolutely.
Rome controls Gaul. Rome controls the Balkans. Rome controls Hispania. If they somehow manage to march 100,000 starting people, including women and children, over the freezing passes of the Alps, where exactly are they escaping to?
Right.
They are just walking into another Roman province where seasoned, battle-hardened legions are already stationed.
Yeah, the logistics of crossing the Alps with a massive civilian baggage train are nearly insurmountable. You were looking at mass starvation, exposure, hostile local tribes, and that's even before you engage a Roman army on the other side.
Exactly. So was Crixus just being greedy by wanting to stay and pillage, or did he recognize a brutal reality that Spartacus ignored, that there was just no running away from the Roman Empire?
It's a very fair point.
If they are trapped in a war of annihilation, the strategic move might actually be to stay in the heartland of the enemy, destroy their agricultural base, plunder their wealth to fund the army, and force Rome to bleed out at home.
Yeah, it might have been a grim, pragmatic realization.
It really asks you to think about leadership during a trauma-induced crisis. You have two commanders who have endured unimaginable psychological torture in the ludus, looking at the exact same map and drawing two completely incompatible conclusions about survival.
And that ideological divide proves fatal. The army splits. Crixus takes an estimated 30,000 followers and breaks away from the main column.
30,000 men gone.
Yeah. And the Roman Senate capitalizes on this division immediately. A consular army led by Lucius Gellius isolates Crixus's forces near Mount Garganus in the Puglia. Without the tactical brilliance of Spartacus or the overwhelming numerical superiority of the unified host, Crixus is completely outmaneuvered. His force is annihilated, and he dies on the battlefield.
Wow. But despite the loss of 30,000 men and one of his most experienced commanders, Spartacus continues his march north. He confronts the Roman governor of Cisalpine Gaul, Cassius Longinus, who commands a massive force of 10,000 men at Mutina.
And what happens?
Spartacus completely destroys this army as well. The path to the Alps is entirely open. The Roman garrison in the north is totally shattered.
And this is where the historical record presents a really profound mystery. With the Alps literally in sight and no Roman army blocking his path, Spartacus turns around.
Wait, he just turns around?
Yeah. He abandons the march to freedom and marches his army back south, directly into the heart of Italy.
Why?
Well, Appian suggests Spartacus realized his forces weren't disciplined enough to survive the crossing, or perhaps his followers simply refused to leave the rich plunder of Italy. We don't know for sure, but whatever the reasoning, the decision to turn south forces the Roman Senate into a state of absolute terror.
They realize the state is facing collapse. The consuls have failed. The praetors have failed. So the Senate just hits the absolute panic button. They strip the current leadership of their commands and grant sweeping dictatorial military authority to Marcus Licinius Crassus.
Yes, Crassus.
We need to dissect who Crassus was, because he is the perfect foil to Spartacus. Spartacus is the man with nothing. Crassus is arguably the wealthiest man in the history of Rome.
Oh, unquestionably.
His immense fortune was built largely on disaster capitalism. He famously operated a private fire brigade that would show up to burning buildings and refuse to extinguish the flames until the desperate owner sold the property to Crassus at a fraction of its value.
Just a completely ruthless individual. Crassus is hyper-ambitious, and he's deeply insecure about his lack of military glory compared to his contemporaries, like Pompey the Great.
Right.
The Senate tasks him with crushing the rebellion, and Crassus essentially uses his own personal fortune to fund the war effort. He raises, equips, and pays for 6 new legions, combining them with the battered remnants of the consular armies. He brings roughly 40,000 heavily armed professional soldiers to bear.
But Crassus inherits an army that is psychologically broken.
Yes, they are terrified.
The Roman soldiers are terrified of the gladiators. They have seen multiple armies just wiped out. They view Spartacus as something almost supernatural at this point.
Yeah.
Crassus understands that if his soldiers step onto the battlefield trembling, the legions will break formation and the gladiators will butcher them. He needs to reestablish the psychological hierarchy. He needs his men to fear him infinitely more than they fear the enemy.
And he achieves this by resurrecting an archaic, horrific military punishment that really hadn't been widely used in centuries.
Decimation.
Right, decimation. After a detachment of Roman soldiers breaks ranks and flees during a skirmish with Spartacus's forces, Crassus isolates the cowardly cohorts, roughly 500 men. He divides them into groups of 10. Each group is forced to draw lots. The one man who draws the marked lot is sentenced to die.
So what does this all mean? The cruelty of decimation is not just in the execution, it is in the methodology. The Roman state does not execute the condemned man.
Though they don't.
The other 9 men in his group, the men he shared a tent with, the men who marched beside him, are forced to beat him to death with clubs.
It's unimaginable.
It's like the most horrific corporate team-building exercise imaginable. If the punishment for a unit failing is that you might have to beat your own tent mate to death, how does that build a cohesive fighting force?
Well, the psychological trauma inflicted on the survivors is deliberate. You are forcing the soldiers to internalize the brutality of the commander. If they flee the enemy, they might die. But if they disobey Crassus, they will be forced to murder their closest friends before facing execution themselves. It completely eradicates the concept of unit cohesion based on brotherhood.
Okay.
and replaces it with an iron grip of collective terror. The locus of survival shifts entirely. The soldiers realize their only hope of living through the week is strict, unquestioning obedience to Crassus, regardless of the enemy they face.
And this brutal recalibration of the Roman war machine fundamentally changes the momentum of the conflict. Crassus's legions stop retreating. They begin a systematic, relentless pursuit, driving Spartacus and his army further and further south.
Right.
Spartacus relies on his maneuverability, fighting rearguard actions, but he is running out of territory. Crassus pushes the massive rebel column into the extreme south of Italy, into the region of Calabria, the very toe of the Italian boot.
And the geography in Calabria really dictates the final act of the war. Spartacus is cornered in a narrow peninsula. It's late 71 BC. Crassus doesn't immediately engage in a massive pitched battle, though.
What does he do?
Instead, he unleashes the defining characteristic of Roman military supremacy: logistics and engineering. He orders his legions to build a wall across the entire isthmus at Rhegium.
And we aren't talking about a hastily assembled wooden fence. Crassus commands his men to construct a 35-mile-long defensive fortification stretching from the Tyrrhenian Sea to the Ionian Sea.
It's a massive undertaking.
They dig a trench 15 feet wide and 15 feet deep, backed by a massive earthen wall topped with timber palisades and spiked stakes. And he builds this in the middle of winter under constant harassment from rebel raiding parties.
It is an overwhelming display of imperial capacity. Rome is basically choking the rebellion to death. The wall cuts Spartacus off from all land-based supply routes. The rebel army, with its massive civilian population, is trapped in a completely scorched landscape. Winter is setting in, and starvation rapidly begins to decimate the camp.
So Spartacus recognizes that attempting to breach a fortified Roman wall head-on is strategic suicide.
Right.
So he pivots his strategy to the sea. He attempts to bypass the wall entirely by securing naval transport. Spartacus negotiates a deal with a massive fleet of Cilician pirates operating in the Mediterranean. He uses the vast reserves of looted Roman gold and silver to pay the pirates to ferry his army across the narrow Strait of Messina to the island of Sicily. The strategic logic is sound. Sicily was home to massive latifundia with hundreds of thousands of slaves. If Spartacus lands there, he can ignite a fourth servile war and replenish his army.
But the pirates take the gold.
Oh.
And the geopolitical landscape intervenes. The Roman general Pompey the Great is returning from Spain with his victorious, battle-hardened legions. The Roman governor in Macedonia, Lucullus, is landing forces in the south.
So the Romans are closing in from everywhere.
Everywhere. The pirates realize that ferrying a rebel army into a Roman province while the entire Mediterranean is swarming with elite Roman navies and legions is just a total death sentence for their fleet. So they betray the agreement. They sail away with the treasure, leaving the gladiators stranded.
I just try to place myself on that shoreline. You are standing on the beach in the freezing wind. You have tens of thousands of starving people, families who followed you because you promised them they would never wear chains again, looking to you for a miracle.
Yeah.
Behind you is a 35-mile Roman death trap. In front of you is the ocean and the empty horizon where the pirate sails just disappeared. The sheer, suffocating despair of that betrayal is incomprehensible.
But Spartacus refuses to let his people starve in the mud. He waits for a massive winter storm to hit the region, utilizing the chaotic weather to mask his movements.
Okay.
Under the cover of blinding snow and rain, his forces fill a section of Crassus's massive trench with earth, timber, and even the corpses of their own dead horses. They create a makeshift bridge, breach the wall, and force their way out of the trap, escaping north into Lucania.
The breakout is successful, but the strategic situation is basically hopeless at this point. Crassus immediately pursues, and worse, the Senate informs Crassus that Pompey and Lucullus are closing in.
And Crassus is terrified that after doing all the brutal work, Pompey will arrive at the last second, crush the remnants of the army, and steal the glory.
Right.
This forces Crassus to force an engagement. Spartacus's army is fracturing again. Splinter groups break off and are immediately slaughtered by the Roman vanguard. Spartacus realizes the long game is over.
He turns his depleted, starving army around near the Silarus River. He aligns his forces for one final pitched battle against Crassus. And the ancient texts give us this deeply revealing detail about his mindset in these final hours.
At a very famous moment.
Before the battle begins, Spartacus has brought his war horse. He draws his sword and kills the animal in front of his troops.
He announces that if they win the battle, he will have his choice of all the fine Roman horses on the field. If they lose, he will not need a horse because he will not retreat. He commits to fighting on foot with his infantry.
Wow.
But his tactical plan for the battle is not just a blind, suicidal charge. He analyzes the Roman lines and identifies Crassus. Spartacus attempts a decapitation strike.
And this raises an important question about that final tactical decision, because it wasn't just a suicide charge. The tactical logic here is brilliant in its desperation. Spartacus knows that Crassus holds his army together through fear.
Exactly.
The Roman legions are bound by the threat of decimation, not loyalty. If Spartacus can drive a wedge through the Roman lines and personally kill Crassus, the command structure might shatter. Without their dictator, the psychological grip on the Roman troops could break, leading to a massive rout.
So Spartacus forms a specialized commando squad of his most elite fighters. When the battle lines clash, he ignores the flanks and leads a concentrated, ferocious push directly at the Roman command center.
Straight for Crassus.
Straight for him. The combat is horrific. The sources tell us Spartacus fights his way through the chaotic crush of shields and spears, getting so close to Crassus that he personally kills 2 centurions who step in to defend the general.
He nearly succeeds. But the sheer weight of Roman numbers just proves insurmountable. The disciplined legionary lines close around the rebel wedge. Spartacus is wounded in the leg by a spear. Appian writes that he dropped to one knee, holding his heavy Myrmillo shield in front of him, continuing to fight off attackers with his sword until he was finally overwhelmed and hacked to pieces.
His body is never recovered from the battlefield. He is just swallowed up in the mass grave of his followers. The Roman war machine systematically slaughters the remaining rebel forces on the field.
It's a total defeat.
Yes. Crassus achieves his decisive victory, but he wants to ensure that the psychological terror he inflicted on his own troops is now projected outward onto the entire enslaved population of the Republic.
Right.
He takes 6,000 prisoners captured in the aftermath of the battle and sentences them to crucifixion.
The sheer scale of this execution requires vast logistical organization. Crucifixion was not merely a method of execution, it was a highly engineered tool of state terrorism designed to inflict maximum agony and public humiliation.
Yes.
Crassus orders the 6,000 crosses to be erected along the Via Appia, the primary highway leading from Capua, the city where the rebellion began in the Ludus, all the way to the gates of Rome.
That is a 130-mile stretch of road, a cross placed roughly every 100 feet.
The visual and olfactory horror of that landscape is difficult to even process. For months, perhaps years, every merchant, every foreign dignitary, and every enslaved person transported along that road walked under the rotting corpses of the rebel army.
Yeah.
It wasn't just punishment, it was an ancient billboard system advertising Roman supremacy. The Senate was broadcasting a message written in human agony. This is the inevitable result of challenging the Roman order.
And Crassus achieves his objective. There would never be another large-scale slave rebellion in the history of the Roman Republic or the subsequent empire. By all contemporary metrics, the Servile War ended in total Roman victory. The rebellion was crushed, the leaders were dead, and the institution of slavery continued to expand.
But the physical death of Spartacus on the battlefield of Silarus is not the end of the narrative, is it?
No, not at all.
In fact, as we look at the later historical sources, the dynamic shifts entirely. Rome won the military conflict, but the defeated Gladiator ultimately conquered the historical memory. He undergoes one of the most remarkable post-mortem transformations of any figure in antiquity. The man who vanished into the mud is resurrected centuries later as a foundational myth.
And this happens because the scarcity of primary sources written from the perspective of the rebels, since all our accounts come from the Romans who defeated them, it creates a vacuum.
Right. We know what he did, but not what he thought.
Exactly. We know the tactics Spartacus used, but we have no written record of his personal ideology, his political philosophy, or his internal thoughts. He basically becomes a blank canvas, allowing subsequent generations to project their own contemporary struggles onto his legacy.
We see this profoundly in the 18th century. The French Enlightenment philosopher Voltaire, who was deeply critical of the devastating European wars of his era, examined the historical record of the Servile War. Voltaire famously declared it a just war, indeed the only just war in history.
And we must be precise in our analysis here for the listener. We are strictly examining how these historical figures utilize the myth of Spartacus to validate their own philosophical frameworks.
Yes, exactly. We're just reporting what they said.
Right. So Voltaire is grappling with the concept of liberty and human rights. To him, state-sponsored wars of conquest are inherently immoral. But the violence perpetrated by an enslaved individual fighting solely to reclaim their basic humanity is philosophically justified. Spartacus becomes the avatar of Enlightenment ideals regarding natural rights.
The appropriation accelerates in the 19th century with Karl Marx. Marx studies the socioeconomic conditions of the Roman Republic, the massive latifundia, the displaced rural peasants, the millions of agricultural slaves, and he applies his own theoretical framework to the conflict.
What did he say about him?
He calls Spartacus a great general, noble character and a real representative of the ancient proletariat.
Marx is analyzing the servile war through the lens of historical materialism and class struggle. He isn't looking at a Thracian gladiator. He sees the ultimate historical precedent for the oppressed working class taking up arms against a hyper-wealthy, exploitative elite.
Right.
The fact that Spartacus united both slaves and impoverished Roman citizens perfectly aligns with Marx's theories on the inevitable conflict between labor and capital. Spartacus is essentially drafted posthumously into serving as the ultimate Marxist hero.
And again, just to be clear, we are neutrally exploring why Marx claimed him, not endorsing the ideology itself.
Exactly.
But the cultural appropriation extends far beyond political philosophy. It enters the realm of global pop culture. In 1960, Hollywood releases a massive blockbuster film, Spartacus, directed by Stanley Kubrick and starring Kirk Douglas.
This is a huge movie.
And the context of that film's production is fascinating. The screenplay was written by Dalton Trumbo, a writer who had been blacklisted during the McCarthy era. The film portrays Spartacus not just as a rebel, but as a deeply Americanized symbol of freedom fighting against totalitarian oppression.
The legacy permeates even the athletic world. Across Eastern Europe and Russia, professional sports organizations, most notably soccer teams like Spartak Moscow, adopted his name. The physical prowess and the enduring resistance to authoritarian control made the gladiator an ideal mascot for athletic excellence and working-class pride.
Yeah.
Barry Strauss correctly identifies that Spartacus remains and this is a, quote, enduring emblem of resistance to oppression.
The incredible irony of his legacy is profound. Based on the military maneuvers we've tracked in the sources, Spartacus was a man navigating a chaotic, impossible situation, desperately trying to keep his people alive, outmaneuver the Roman legions, and likely just find a way home to Thrace.
Yeah, he probably just wanted to go home.
Right. He did not launch a crusade to abolish the global institution of slavery, nor did he write treatises on class struggle. Yet, because he dared to shatter the illusion of Roman invincibility, he has been posthumously drafted into being a mascot for everything from French philosophy and global socialist movements to 1960s Hollywood cinema and modern sports.
He achieved the one thing Rome tried to prevent. The crosses on the Via Appia were designed to erase his memory and replace it with terror. Instead, the brutality of the Roman response only calcified his legend. The empire crumbled, but the myth of the gladiator who fought the empire survived completely intact.
When you trace the trajectory of this deep dive through the sources, the scale of the achievement remains staggering regardless of the mythology. We tracked a man who survived the sensory deprivation and psychological torture of the Murmillo training in Capua.
We watched 70 desperate fugitives armed with meat cleavers execute a flawless night rappel down the vine-covered cliffs of Mount Vesuvius to annihilate a Roman encampment.
We analyzed the logistical miracle of feeding a mobile city of 100,000 outcasts through the freezing passes of the Apennines.
And we examined the tactical brilliance of the final decapitation strike against Crassus on the plains of Calabria.
It is a study in irregular warfare, the fatal consequences of imperial arrogance, and the terrifying lengths an entrenched superpower will go to in order to maintain its hegemony. Rome deployed decimation, 35-mile walls, and mass crucifixion simply to restore the status quo.
Yeah, the extremes they went to are just unbelievable.
And that leads to a final thought for you to ponder, something that builds on the fundamental mechanics we've discussed today. We spend a lot of time analyzing Rome's military supremacy, their engineering, and their geopolitical dominance.
Right.
But the ultimate irony of the Third Servile War is not merely that an enslaved man almost brought the Republic to its knees. The irony is that Rome completely manufactured its own reckoning.
They did.
They captured a proud Thracian auxiliary. They systematically stripped away his humanity. They invested massive resources into enhancing his physical lethality. They meticulously trained him to fight in close quarters for their own entertainment, and then they handed him a sword.
It's just wild.
So consider this. What does it say about a civilization when its absolute greatest existential threat is not an invading foreign army, but a weapon forged entirely by the very entertainment system it uses to project its power and dominance? The Romans built the ludus to project their absolute superiority, but they were actually engineering their own conqueror. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the sources, and as always, keep questioning the history you think you know.